Hello and welcome to the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, and today, can you increase productivity simply by growing the economy? In short, do we work harder when we're busier? In which case, priming the economy should improve productivity. But does that theory stack up? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast. Now, Steve, there's a theory from a Dutch economist, Petrus Johannes Verdoorn, back in 1949, that if you boost GDP by whatever means, perhaps through some sort of fiscal stimulus, then you will automatically see productivity grow. Now, we normally think of productivity growing out of technological change, but this seems to hint that if the economy is growing and people are rewarded, they will work harder. So, is there any supporting evidence to this theory?
Well, this is the Verdoorn's law. It's one of these empirical observations, which is a bit like another one called Oken's law. And Oken observed that if GDP grew by 3% or more, then unemployment would fall. And it's an empirical regularity. When the GDP grows at that particular rate, then unemployment grows more slowly or falls because the factors influencing how many people you employ. First of all, the number of people being born. So, what's the actual rate of growth of the labour force? And back when Oken was writing, the labour force was growing at about 1 to 1.25% per annum. And then the other factor was productivity, and that was growing when he wrote at about 1.5 to 2% per annum. So you had to be above both those in terms of actual real GDP growth for the level of unemployment to fall. And so Verdoorn's law is part of that particular argument as well. And what that says is, what's the causation? So what you're getting out of Oken was the idea that if you grow by more than X percent, then with a combination of the labour force and the productivity of each worker, and I'm putting that in inverted commas, by the way, because I don't believe it is the productivity of each worker. But if the sum of the growth of population and the growth in the productivity of each worker was less than the rate of economic growth, then the proportion of population employed would rise and therefore unemployment would fall. That's Oken's law. So Verdoorn's law is to say, well, actually the causation effectively runs from GDP change to productivity. If GDP change if GDP change grows by more than a certain amount, then, inverted commas, labour productivity will grow as well. And these two regularities were sort of rules of thumb that used to exist back in the days when we actually had empirically derived macroeconomic models rather than the nonsense we have these days.
Why would that be? Apart from the idea that if GDP grows, productivity grows. Except for the fact that people. I guess if you're busy, if you're selling stuff and there's a bigger demand for it, then you're going to work harder because demand is there. Is that what's sitting behind this theory?
Well, this is the way people normally think about it, and I think it's wrong.
Right.
Okay. And the reason that I think it's wrong is that I don't think workers got any more productive since the days of Hannibal, and I don't mean Hannibal Lecter. I want to go right back to the days of the Roman Empire and say that, if anything, the productivity of people is lower now than it was back under Hannibal and Caesar. And the reason is what we do as workers. This is obviously implied to unskilled labour, and I've got to qualify that straight away, because when we look at all the calculations that are done behind things like Oken's law and Verdoorn's law and so on, relate to unskilled labour. It's not talking about the contribution of Einstein. It's talking about the contribution of somebody who can be told, pick up that log and move it from there to there, which is unskilled labour. So what unskilled labour is effectively all you have to have is sufficient intelligence to follow an instruction and apply the energy that you possess to carry that instruction out. So back in Hannibal's day, Hannibal sounds good because we don't talk about Caesar Lecter, it's always Hannibal Lecter. Back in Hannibal's day, you said, go and grab that rope and put it around that elephant's neck. And these days, you say, go and grab that widget,
whatever it is.
Widget, and shove it into the hole that's 5 millimeters below the top of the box.
Right. So you're saying you're not going to do that any faster, no matter what. But isn't part of this argument to say, well, actually, you might do it a bit faster if you feel as though times are good, the economy's going strong, there's increased demand. Your employer might say, look, if you stick that widget in that hole 10,000 times, I'm going to give you a 10% bonus.
That's not what changes. It isn't the speed at which the worker changes. It's the hole into which he shoves the widget that changes, because with the higher level of pardon the expression, with the higher level of economic growth, you have shortages of labour developing as well. But what you certainly have is, and particularly if you have high wages, it becomes advantageous to the employer to say, I'm going to see if somebody can invent a machine that will do what that worker was doing, and therefore I have a machine which replaces the worker. But there's such a level of demand going on at the same time that more jobs are springing up for the workers that are displaced than the number of workers themselves being displaced. So unemployment is falling, but the actual technology with which the work is being done has changed, and that technology needs less labour. Therefore, when you do your mathematics of dividing because the way labour productivity is defined is simply dividing GDP by the number of workers. That's the definition of labour productivity. Divide GDP, which is and this is where a whole range of issues come in terms of what the hell are you measuring? Because if you look at how GDP is defined in dollars. Okay, and remember, and we're even doing a deflation there, because it's not actual dollars; it's dollars to some base year, which we've calculated using a set of indices. There's I'm a bit. So
adjusted for inflation, in other words.
Well, you work out. You use what's called the Sprays index, I think it is, to there's the Sprays and Parsh indexes. Two different ways of working out today's output and yesterday's prices, so that you can therefore say what's the actual quantity change between last year and this year. So first of all, you do that to get your real GDP. Then you divide that real GDP by the number of workers you hired. So what's the employment rate, the level of employment? That's easy enough to do. So you get a number, which when I do this, I'm following Goodwin's conventions. I use the letter A for labour productivity. So A is output, which is Y, divided by labour, which is L. Now, that's the way it's calculated. Now, GDP, which is the Y, is calculated in effectively dollars per year. And the labour is calculated in hours per year. So what you're getting is dollars per hour of labour coming out as your calculation. Now, that's a reasonable, in terms of its dimensionality, that's a reasonable concept to have. But what is actually giving you those dollars per hour? That's the productive system, which is where you're using. One of my I now have at least I have two hobby horses these days. I've improved over those having one hobby horse. It's labour, machinery, and not debt, energy.
Right.
Those are okay. So what you're seeing is something has changed the amount of energy that you're generating through production. And the two potential sources are your workers are putting in more calories, or your machines are pumping through more gigadoules. And believe me, because they're exactly in terms of units, if I'm working with, ultimately energy can all be resolved down to the same measurements. You measure in kilowatts and things like that. But the energy that the machines pump out is far greater than the energy we can ever do. So what you're doing is you've got a worker who might be able to whack in, and then quite seriously, this is the level of energy we can put in. The maximum amount of energy that can be sustained by a worker is about the level of an old-fashioned light bulb. About between 80 and Arnie Schwarzenegger might manage 120 watts. Most of us manage about 90. Okay, so that's the amount of power putting in, and that hasn't changed since the days of Hannibal. That's been constant. Right. So what's changed is the amount of energy being put through by the machines. And what happens, I believe, and when you have the type of thing which Verdoorn is observing, is that when the level of economic growth is high, then the desire to invest and develop technology rises, and therefore you get a positive feedback between the level of growth and the rate of innovation, and that's what gives you his relationship.
Do you know, this is such an interesting discussion. I do feel a bit guilty cutting it short, but if you want to hear it in full, then you need to subscribe to this podcast on debunkingeconomics.com. Choose one of the subscription options in the right-hand column, or become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen. If you pledge $10 or more support each month, then you get access to this and all the other podcasts in full. So hopefully you'll do that, and we'll see you back here very soon. Thanks for listening.